Families buried urns filled with cement dust, while their relatives remained behind Tri-State Crematory. Investigators searched property and ultimately recovered 334 bodies. In February 2002, authorities searched Tri-State Crematory in Noble, Georgia, following reports that human remains were not being handled properly. Tri-State accepted bodies through funeral homes and was supposed to cremate them, then return remains to families. Search revealed a problem far beyond paperwork or delay. Bodies had been left on property instead of cremated, while some families had already received containers, represented as ashes. Discovery turned routine death care transactions into a recovery and identification operation spanning grounds and structures. The investigation began in February 2002 at Tri-State Crematory in Noble, Georgia. Authorities first entered a business that was supposed to turn remains into ashes and soon confronted evidence that the promised work had not occurred. The recovery expanded beyond one building and one apparent failure. Bodies were documented across the property, while funeral homes and families tried to determine whose arrangements had been falsified. The final count reached 334. Cremation depends on a custody chain that grieving families rarely see. A funeral home accepts the body, documents the transfer, sends the remains to a crematory, and later returns a container to the family. At Tri-State, the physical evidence contradicted the records and containers that appeared to complete that chain. Bodies remained on the Noble property, even though funeral homes and relatives had been told cremations were finished. Investigators therefore had to match each recovery to transfer records, promised services, and the family that had received false information. The central failure was not an obscure ritual. It was a broken system of custody, verification, and trust. Tri-State worked as a contractor for funeral homes across the region. Many families arranged everything through a local funeral director and never dealt directly with the crematory in Noble. That structure helps explain how one rural facility could receive remains from numerous communities, while returned containers moved back through businesses families already trusted. Once authorities searched the property, they had to trace those transactions in reverse, from a recovered person to a transfer record to a represented cremation, and finally to relatives who believed a memorial was complete. The scale was administrative as well as physical. Hundreds of recoveries had to be reconciled with business records and individual notifications. One operator's repeated conduct had spread through a professional network far beyond the property line. Tri-State served as a contractor for funeral homes across the region. Families often arranged everything through a local funeral director and never dealt directly with the Noble facility. That structure helps explain the scale. One operator could receive remains from many communities, while returned containers passed back through businesses families already trusted. Once authorities searched the property, records had to be traced in reverse, from remains in Noble to a transfer to a promised cremation, and finally to relatives who believed a memorial was complete. The case was therefore not only a search of buildings and grounds, it was a vast reconciliation between physical evidence and a paper trail that had represented hundreds of services as finished. Tri-State did not announce itself as a place where something was wrong. To a family arriving with a loved one's remains, it was a crematory in rural Noble, Georgia, a business entrusted with a private and painful responsibility. Its grounds included buildings, sheds, open areas, and woods. Those ordinary features would take on a terrible significance once authorities began searching. A crematory is supposed to perform a defined task. It receives a body, carries out the cremation, and returns the ashes to the family. The process depends on trust because relatives are rarely present to verify each step. At Tri-State, Investigators found that the remains were not contained in one location or explained by one apparent mistake. Bodies were discovered in sheds, woods, and buildings across the property. The distribution mattered. One misplaced body might point to a failure in a single moment. Remains left in different places suggested repetition over time and decisions made out of public view. No single doorway could contain the explanation. The search required investigators to treat the entire site as a record of what had been concealed. Each structure and stretch of ground raised the same unanswered question: how long had this been happening? Tri-State operated for years as a specialized link in regional funeral system. Funeral homes did not all own cremation equipment, so contracting with outside facility was normal. That normality explains why one rural facility could take custody of remains from numerous businesses and jurisdictions. It also explains why families might never know name or location of crematory until investigation. Their contract and conversation could be with local funeral director, while physical transfer continued elsewhere. Accountability therefore involved Marsh's conduct and duties of businesses that relied on Tri-State. Later civil litigation examined those relationships. Before this case becomes a number, it has to return to the families living with a death. They had made calls, signed forms, and entrusted a funeral service with a responsibility they could not reasonably perform themselves. For many people, cremation offers a practical way through an unbearable time. It promises that the body will be treated with care, transformed, and returned with dignity. When an urn comes home, it can give a family somewhere to place their grief. They may bury it, keep it close, or visit it on anniversaries. The object carries an assurance that the final arrangements are complete. Families who used Tri-State paid for that assurance and had every reason to believe the service had been performed. That is why the reported substitution of concrete dust or other material was more than a financial deception. If relatives were handed urns that did not hold the remains they expected, their final goodbye rested on false information. The people they mourned had not been where they believed. The harm was not limited to what investigators found on the grounds. It also reached into homes, memorials, and private rituals that had already taken place. Each family had been asked to trust an object as proof. The investigation would test whether that proof was real or whether it had concealed an unbearable deception. Court records describe harm as more than failure to perform a paid service. Families made permanent decisions based on false representation that cremation had occurred. Some buried containers, scattered supposed ashes, or kept them as memorial objects. Once remains were recovered, relatives could face another identification and disposition process after believing it was complete. Criminal counts and later civil cases reflected repeated individual injuries inside one operation. Number 334 reveals scale, but each record connects to one person and one set of relatives who trusted professional chain. Authorities did not know the final total when they entered Tri-State. Reports of improper handling led to a search, and each new recovery expanded both the physical area under examination and the number of business records investigators needed to reconcile. The question grew from whether one set of remains had been mishandled to how many families had received false information. Recovery and identification moved together. Investigators documented what was present, then worked to determine which transfer promised cremation, and family corresponded to it. The eventual count of 334 came from that operation, not from an early estimate. Every addition to the total represented another person whose final arrangements had not occurred as relatives were told. Authorities did not know the final total when the search began. Each new recovery expanded the area investigators had to examine and the number of records they had to reconcile. Identification was essential because the site contained people whose families had already received assurances that cremation was complete. The work moved in two directions at once: recover and document what was physically present, then determine which promise, transfer, and family corresponded to it. The eventual figure of 334 represents the result of that process, not an early estimate or a rumor amplified for headlines. Brent Marsh operated Tri-State Crematory, while bodies continued arriving and completed cremations were represented to funeral homes and families. Investigators compared remains on the property with transfer documents and containers returned as ashes. The contradiction was operational, not mysterious. The business accepted custody, the promised service was not performed, and records or substitutes allowed the transaction to appear finished. Repetition turned one breach into hundreds and allowed remains to accumulate until the physical site exposed what paperwork had concealed. Tri-State could appear to complete each transaction because custody and completion were represented through records and returned containers. The funeral home that had transferred a body could receive something labeled as ashes and pass it to relatives without seeing the work inside the crematory. That separation created room for repeated deception. Investigators closed the gap by comparing the people physically recovered in Noble with the services listed as finished. Every mismatch linked a hidden failure at the facility to a document, a container, and a family elsewhere. The case exposed a vulnerability built into death care. Families cannot usually watch a cremation or personally verify every transfer. They rely on identity documents, custody records, equipment logs, and licensed professionals to confirm that a private service was completed. At Tri-State, ordinary signs of completion could circulate even though the promised disposition had not occurred. A returned container, receipt, or signed form looked conclusive until investigators compared it with bodies recovered on the property. That comparison transformed paperwork from reassurance into evidence. The mechanism was painfully simple. Appearance carried trust, while physical verification was absent. Once the grounds were searched, the gap between those two realities could no longer remain hidden. For families, investigation created practical decisions as well as grief. Authorities had to identify remains, compare them with transfer records, and communicate which final arrangements were false. One container could no longer serve as proof by itself. Tri-State showed cost when paperwork and returned container appear complete, while physical reality contradicts them. A container returned to a family could no longer verify anything by itself. Investigators needed identity records and evidence that the cremation equipment had actually been used for the person named. That difference between an object and an auditable process became the case's central control failure. Trust had been reduced to appearance, and appearance survived until the property contradicted it. Physical recovery proved that remains had not been handled as represented, but criminal accountability required investigators to connect people, records, and repeated acts. They compared identities with funeral home transfers, containers returned to relatives, and statements that cremations were complete. Prosecutors then organized that conduct into different categories of charges. This is why Marsh's 787-count guilty plea cannot be read as one count for each of the 334 bodies. Different offenses and victims produced a total larger than the recovery count. The plea established responsibility without a trial reconstructing every transfer. Civil cases separately examined harm to families and duties within the funeral service chain. creating another path for accountability after the criminal case. Recovery alone could show that remains had not been handled as promised. Criminal accountability required more. Investigators compared identities, transferred documents, returned containers, and statements about completed cremations. Prosecutors then organized repeated conduct into hundreds of charges. Marsh's guilty plea covered 787 counts, a number larger than the 334 bodies, because different offenses and victims generated different legal allegations. The plea established responsibility, without a trial reconstructing each transfer. Civil cases separately examined harm to families and the duties of businesses in the service chain. Keeping those paths distinct shows how one discovery became both a criminal prosecution and years of private claims. Identification and notification continued after the first shock of the search. Investigators could not treat hundreds of bodies as interchangeable proof. They had to preserve each recovery, compare physical findings with crematory and funeral home documents, and determine which family had been given false information. A substituted container could support one allegation, while abandonment or improper storage could support another. That detailed work turned a mass discovery back into individual cases and helps explain why the number of criminal counts exceeded the number of bodies. It also forced relatives who believed final arrangements were complete to face another identification and disposition process. For many, the investigation reopened a loss they had already tried to mourn. Identification and notification required patience after the initial shock. Investigators could not treat every body as interchangeable proof of one offense. They had to preserve remains, compare physical findings with business documents, and establish which family had been given false information. A substituted container could support a fraud allegation, while improper storage or abandonment supported different charges. The hundreds of resulting counts reflect those overlapping injuries. This methodical work explains why the legal number exceeds the recovery total, and why accountability continued through civil courts after the criminal plea. The first report described improper handling of remains, language broad enough to suggest a procedural violation. The search rapidly changed its meaning. Authorities found bodies in buildings, sheds, wooded areas, and other parts of the tri-state property. Each recovery contradicted paperwork and containers that had told families a cremation was complete. What began as concern about handling became a reconciliation of hundreds of people, transfers, and false assurances. The restrained opening language was not proof of a cover-up by investigators. It reflected how little was known before the property was examined. The escalation came from physical evidence. A concern led to a search. The search expanded, and the final recovery count reached 334. By end of search, authorities had recovered 334 bodies. Legal case then converted physical discovery into hundreds of counts. Brent Marsh ultimately pleaded guilty to 787 charges. Plea avoided need to speculate about motive. It established responsibility through court process. Sentencing and civil litigation followed, while families continued addressing false ashes and recovered remains. The plea also prevented the legal ending from becoming a speculative motive story. A court did not need to decide why every body was left in a particular place to establish the conduct covered by 787 counts. Marsh accepted criminal responsibility and received 12 years in prison. That outcome is precise enough to carry the payoff. By the end of the recovery operation, authorities had found 334 bodies at Tri-State. Search teams recovered remains from structures, outdoor spaces, and woods throughout the property, while many families possessed containers they believed held ashes. Some substitutes were reported as cement dust. Investigators then had to connect the mass discovery to individual identities, transfers, and notifications. The case also required care in separating Marsh's admitted conduct from assumptions about every funeral home that used Tri-State. Contracting with an outside crematory was common, and many families never knew the subcontractor's name. Civil litigation examined what businesses knew, represented, and owed their customers. That inquiry remained distinct from Marsh's criminal plea. The case also separated the operator's proven conduct from assumptions about every business that sent remains to Tri-State. Funeral homes commonly contract with outside crematories, and many families never know the subcontractor's name. Civil litigation examined what those businesses knew, represented, and owed their customers. That inquiry was separate from Marsh's guilty plea. The distinction protects innocent assumptions while still asking how a professional chain verifies work performed out of sight. Tri-State's harm reached into funerals and memorials, conducted under false premises. Relatives had signed forms, received containers, and made permanent decisions, believing a loved one's cremation was complete. The case also showed why custody records must be more than paperwork passed between trusted businesses. Identity, transfer, equipment use, and final disposition need independent verification. Marsh's prosecution and the civil claims supplied legal consequences. The deeper consequence was loss of confidence in a service families must often accept without seeing. In Noble, 334 recoveries showed what can happen when professional assurance is allowed to stand in for proof. For relatives, identification could reopen decisions they believed were final. Some had buried a container, kept it in a home, or scattered material presented as ashes. A notification that remains had been recovered meant another round of records, identification, and disposition after a funeral had already occurred. That injury cannot be reduced to property loss. The deception altered mourning itself. A 12-year sentence and civil judgments could recognize wrongdoing, but neither could restore confidence in rituals performed under false information. In the end, Marsh admitted guilt on 787 criminal counts in Walker County Superior Court and received a 12-year prison sentence. The total covered several kinds of conduct and exceeded the number of people recovered because different victims and offenses generated separate charges. Marsh's admissions established criminal liability without requiring a trial for every individual transfer. Lawsuits followed in Tennessee and Georgia, examining harm to families and responsibility within the funeral service chain. Those proceedings offered different forms of accountability, but none reversed memorials held with false ashes or years spent believing promised cremations had occurred. The 12-year sentence supplied a definite criminal consequence, while civil proceedings addressed losses that a prison term could not measure by itself. Families had paid for services, relied on representations, and conducted memorials around material that was not what they believed. Claims also examined responsibilities within the chain of funeral homes and the outside crematory. Criminal and civil courts asked different questions, but both began with the same breach. Remains accepted for cremation were found on the property after completion had been represented to people entitled to the truth. Tri-State exposed how much death care depends on work families cannot personally observe. Equipment records and final disposition must be auditable. A returned container means little if the documents behind it cannot be trusted. In Noble, the appearance of completion outran verification until a search revealed 334 bodies. Criminal punishment and civil judgments acknowledged the breach. but they could not restore confidence to families forced to repeat final arrangements. The lasting question is practical. When a service is hidden by necessity, what proof protects people who have no choice but to trust it? Verification in death care is difficult precisely because privacy and specialization keep families away from most of the process. Effective custody controls connect one identity through transfer, equipment use, disposition, and return. They also allow a funeral provider to confirm work performed by a contractor instead of relying only on a finished-looking container. Tri-State showed that trust without an auditable trail can carry false information through several reputable hands. The search made the hidden part visible only after hundreds of transactions had already appeared complete. Subscribe to Grim Inquiries for more documented cases where evidence matters more than rumor.